Okay, I don't even know why I'm doing this. So I just got back from seeing a movie at school, a documentary called Women Art Revolution, about the feminist art movement. And afterwards there was a panel. Actually, also the movie is by Lynn Hirschman, just in case you wanted to know. There was also a panel afterwards of local women artists, and they were discussing things about the movie and things related to the movie. And my main point is at the very end, someone who is in one of my classes, she said, she basically said something along the lines of, because the movie was really being critiqued, I think, and a lot of the issues with it were being brought up. One of the local artists who was on the panel does video work, and she was really picking up on the kind of, I think, formal aspects that were working really weirdly in the film, which I noticed as well. There were some points where I was like this is just, I can't remember anything exactly, but there were some things that seemed kind of like weird. So it was being critiqued for that, and I'll get to that. But she brought up, her point was, my classmate's point was, that people were kind of sitting around and saying, oh, well, it should have been done. If it were me, I would have done X, Y, Z. And she was like, well, then, what are you doing? Basically, I guess, if you want to relate it to a famous quote, you would do the much overused Gandhi quote about being the change you wish to see in the world, which is, how I took it. And I thought that was a good point, because, yeah, it was kind of, I thought it was interesting that one of the critiques that was brought up during the discussion was relating to how Hirschman made the documentary and how she included herself in it. In the documentary, she states that she wasn't sure about putting herself in it, and she ultimately decided to because she didn't want to continue the practice of omission. I think she worded it something like that. But in the discussion afterwards, that was something that people seemed bothered by in a way, which I thought was interesting, simply because it seemed like they were saying she was making it too much of a personal thing, that the people she had interviewed were kind of like her, someone put it as her girls club. I know, quotation mark thingies. As opposed to going out and hunting down certain people to interview. That it was kind of, someone said that that the filmmaker, Hirschman, described it kind of as her scrapbook of that time when the feminist art movement was, really, really going strong, when it started, when it was, those years in, I guess, the late 60s into the 70s. And I thought that was interesting, since a lot of what is considered feminist art seems to be, it was brought up in the documentary, the whole idea of the personal becoming the political, and, probably vice versa. you know, a lot of feminist work, and I guess just a lot of artwork in general, the assumption is that it's going to be very personal. And so I thought it was interesting that part of the critique, that what bothered people was that Hirschman had made her documentary personal, that it was coming from her perspective and her certain place where she is in society, perhaps, you know, as a woman, as a white woman. Her sexuality was not brought up, so I don't know. Oh, I've lost my train of thought. I thought it was interesting, since it seems like the expectation almost is that feminist art, and well, just feminist art in general, is going to be really personal, and the whole idea that it should be personal and personal political being linked, that it bothered people that she put her own work in, that just seemed really interesting to me. But at the same time, of course, as always, it's very important to critique. You know, you're not ever, I mean, that it's the whole thing with the whole dialogue thing. And one of the things that was brought up was the fact that there weren't a lot of minorities, that, you know, out of all the women who were interviewed, very few of them were minorities. And I think it was most obvious visually when we're talking about racial minorities, that the film didn't really touch on that. They briefly brought up lesbian artists, and then it was like for a minute or so, and then all of a sudden they were off to something else, which was something that really confused me. I think it was one of those technical things that I went, wait, what? Where we were just talking about that, just starting that, where did that go? There's a point in the film where it kind of grinds to a halt, where she says, you know, she shot over 100 hours of footage, and supposedly it's all available online. But and that was something that other people pointed out, and that was part of the discussion. You know, why not make it a bigger thing with more stuff, like more parts to it. And then that it was a lot of discussion with a lot of different points of views feeding into each other that I'm not going to go super into. But it was interesting, because I can see where my classmate is coming from, and I agree with that. You know, it's all fine, well, and good to sit around and point fingers at people and say, well, you didn't do this, and I would have done this, and blah blah blah, when the big question probably should be, well, then what are you going to do? You say you would have done XYZ, so do it, you know. But at the same time, I do think, as always, critique is important, especially since if you know, I think it's interesting that they had a problem with the fact that it was personal, but then problems are created by the fact that it was personal, because it limited who Hirschman interviewed, and it limited kind of who got shown. It's important to remember that when you talk about things like feminism, that there are people within feminism who, you know, people who identify as women, who also identify as other things, and that also impacts their lives. It's not just, you can't say broadly, well, we're all sisters, or some sort of idealistic thing like that, because then you kind of deny the fact that not everyone has had the same experience as you have, and for some people, you know, their sexual identity, their sexual preference, their gender identity, their racial identity, their national identity, all these other identities come into play, and you really have to look at all those different facets. You can't just say we're all in this sisterhood and lump everyone together and say, oh, when you try to talk about race and gender and, you know, as, you know, maybe, you know, transgender, like transgender, I'm sorry, people, I'm fumbling with terms here. People who identify as women, who society would look at and be like, well, you're not women. Trans women have been marginalized and have been called, you know, horrible things within, I mean, they've been excluded from feminist and, like, lesbian dialogue, I guess, like, you know, being accused of not being real women. So if you were to say, you know, oh, we all need to just be a sisterhood to, like, a trans woman, she would probably, you know, be like, especially if you were a cis woman and you're saying that to a trans woman, she's going to be like, what? You don't know where I'm coming from. I've had different experiences as you. And then, you know, if you're a white woman saying to a Latina, you know, oh, we're all a sisterhood, we just need to focus on these certain things, she's going to be like, you have white privilege, you don't have certain experiences that I have had. And I think that was a very important critique to point out during the whole discussion, because that really isn't touched on, and that is where it becomes problematic. I think that the documentary is so personal, because then Hirschman is not really looking past the people she knows to try and delve into those more. So yeah, I don't really have an ending to that at all, except that I'm not wearing the scarf to be hipster. It is cold in this fucking room.